My entire life has been committed to serving my nation. My father, a former army officer, has been putting me through hard physical and mental training since I was 16 years old. He has drilled in me the importance of dedication, bravery, and consistency. So, after completing my coursework with flying colors, I enlisted in the military. My whole life has been spent according to a rigid schedule, and at one point, it did start to seem restrictive. I wished for marriage, as my parents did. They had been married for 33 years, and despite my mother's disability due to a stroke 15 years earlier, my father was loyal to her. This is what I seek, a love that exceeds the need of the flesh, a love that endures in illness and health. I thought I'd discovered that love in Alice, but my hopes were about to be broken. I first saw Alice in church, and I was impressed by her fragile blonde beauty and deep blue eyes. Alice had recently started work at the local pharmacy, so when it was my turn to get my mother's medication, we talked. I finally overcame my nervousness and asked Alice out on a date. It was the start of the happiest period of my life. I was in love, and I assumed Alice felt the same way. I decided to tell my parents about the woman I was in love with. When I took Alice home for Sunday lunch, I noticed his mother's face light up. My mother tightened her grasp on Alice's hand and spoke. Sadly, most people couldn't understand what she was saying, but I did. I understood Mom as saying, "You are prettiest girl in the world, Alice." Alice smiled and hugged my mother. Then my father entered, smiling, and extended his large hand. "Alice," he cried, "I saw you in the pharmacy. So, are you the woman that stole my George?" My dad's hand was shaking by Alice, who flushed pretty. "Welcome to the family, Mr. John," she said. Dad, however, was shaking his head. "Please call me John. A lovely woman hasn't called me John in a very long time." My mother's face suddenly blazed with the pain, while my father was making a joke. Despite my mother's restrictions, we enjoyed a great lunch, and I was struck by Alice's kindness and concern for my parents. I informed my father that I was going to propose to Alice that evening. I laughed. "I'm older than you were when I was born, Dad, so hurry up." My dad gave me a shake of the head. "You're our son then, so the decision is yours. But before you ask, think about it. When I tell my mother, I plan to ask the proposal." She smiled and gently removed her engagement ring, pressing it into my palm. "I am not able to handle this, Mom." She insisted to give Alice the family ring too. I went into Alice's home 2 days later with a large bouquet of red roses and beautiful rings in lovely velvet box. I waited for her to get home while hiding inside her closet. I fantasized about being with Alice forever while I sat there surrounded by her clothing and her fragrances. Then I heard Alice's lovely voice after hearing a key in the lock. She came into the bedroom, which I heard. Then a man's gruff voice yelled her name. I shrieked. Is someone male in the Alice's room? I opened the door just a little bit to find Alice giving a tall man a passionate kiss. The light touched the man's face as he dragged Alice onto the bed. My father was there. I was isolated within that closet, sick to my stomach, listening to every tear and word of that trickery. They finally nodded off, so I snuck away. My anger was bulbing over. I wanted their death. When I spotted my father's car parked in front of Alice's building, I knew it would provide the ideal means of retaliation. I opened the hood and played about with the brake line. The brakes would malfunction as they reached the steep slope going into town, and 2 persons who had ruined my life and the happiness of my mother would be dead. When I returned home, however, I was unable to ignore the memories of my father's face, love and gentleness for my mother and me. Even though my father had made a terrible mistake, I couldn't bear to see his pain. I got in his car and headed over to Alice's place. I suddenly steered my car forcefully, blocking my father and Alice, who was in the car and prepared to go off. Deathly pale, my father leaped out of the car. It's not what you think, George. Dad, that is, I sadly told him. My heart was poisoned by all I saw and heard you and Alice doing this afternoon, so I destroyed your brake lines. I meant to murder you. "George," my father cried, "I am very sorry, son. Both your mother and I love you." "It was this foolishness, Dad," I replied. "I know about madness. It was nonsense that made me try to kill you both. However, I now see that I love you more than I could ever hate you." I hugged my father and wept while holding each other. "I love your mother, George. I do, but one day she kissed me and I couldn't stop myself," said my dad. "She slept with you?" George yelled. "When?" Dad gave a headshake. "She and I first met in pharmacy and we later met at the supermarket. That was how it began. It's your affair," I said. "And you kept quiet?" John said. "When you went in with her, I couldn't believe it. I knew she was tricking both of us, son. I am sorry. I'm sorry." My father apologized to me and told me that she was my need and I was her. "But she loves you, my son," Dad said to me. "We will not do anything like that anymore." Alice then stepped out of the car. She asked, her large blue eyes blinking. "George, baby, love you, sweetie." When Alice found out that I knew everything, she apologized to me and assured me that she truly loves me and will not do anything like this in the future. I forgave both of them because I loved them both so much. I didn't tell my mother anything about Dad and Alice, as I thought that his heart would be broken if she finds out about this. I married Alice and we lived happily ever after. We were both living happily. My parents were happy as well. My mother was sick, but my dad took good care of her because he loved her a lot. When I saw the love of my parents, my heart felt peaceful. My wife took great care of my mother. Our relationship grew stronger with time. Now I started to blindly trust my wife. I've spent my entire life helping my country. Since I was 16 years old, my father, a former military officer, put me through rigorous physical and mental training. He has imparted to me the value of dedication, courage, and consistency. I joined the military as a result. Having excelled in my academics, I followed a regular schedule my whole life, and at one point it did start to feel incredibly constricting. I was forced to carry on my father's legacy too. I could not have survived without my love, sweetheart Alice. I had moved to another city by the second week of our new marriage. Despite my desire to be with her and enjoy my one source of happiness, I reported for service out of fear of failing my father. As the weeks and months passed, Alice continued calling to ask me to come to see her soon. However, I was unable to see her. Instead, I began writing letters exactly like I had in the past. We frequently talked through video conferences, but I kept writing to her. Even though she was terrible at it, she would send me some back, but I loved it. After our wedding, it had been almost exactly a year and a half since I last saw Alice. Too much pain comes from having to be apart from her. I desperately wanted to return to her, but I had to do what she was expected of me. I was allowed to spend 2 weeks at home after 2 months. I was happy to the heart. With a smile on her face, Alice was waiting for me. I was very happy to see her. The initial days were a complete pleasure, but I soon became aware that something was odd. She sometimes appeared a little sad or distant, but I did not want to waste our enjoyable time talking about sad times. Therefore, I made every effort to happy her. I finally had to leave once again. This time I posted for 8 months. At the borders, time went slowly but painfully, yet Alice managed to keep me happy. I had no other motivation but the need to see her again. I had a duty as an army officer. Our videos conversation also became less frequent as the number of letters from Alice decreased. I also determined to speak with her when I returned home a second time. However, this time I did not let her know that I was returning home since I had a surprise planned. I was rather delighted as I saw the joy on her face. When I arrived at our home that day, there were clothes everywhere. The entire house appeared to be in a mess. I pushed my bags into the corner and went in search of my mom. I did not want to wake my mother up because she was sleeping in her room. Then I went looking for Alice in her bedroom with a bunch of flowers. The door to our room was already slightly opened. From the corridor outside our room, I looked for Alice. Then I found her in bed with another man. both of them sleeping off on top of one another. Guess who the man could be? My father was him. From my hand, the bouquet fell to the ground. I immediately began whispering, "Alice, where are you, sweetie?" Frightening both of them, my wife was hiding her AP in her closet. I pretended to be unaware. Alice had surprised, yet awfully sad expressions. I was so upset by the infidelity that I immediately booked myself in a hotel and stopped speaking to her. I became irritated by her constant calls, but I had never cried before. My dad, whom I loved with all my heart, and my wife, who was cheating on me. I had difficulty accepting everything. I wept a lot and moaned a bit. I was consoling myself by telling myself that it wasn't too sick for me to love her again and again. She hurt me every time. When I recovered a bit, I pretended to be unaware and took my wife on an emergency vacation. She is upset now. Now she's restless as hell because I thought she was missing my dad, and I was right at that time. We would have been on the vacation for 10 days. One day she told me that he couldn't take it anymore. She told me everything about her and my dad, and she said that we cannot live without each other. We are dependent on the sex lives of one another. I soon realized on the occasions that my wife is no longer mine. There was no sex between us. She didn't even like coming to me. I couldn't bear my dad and my unfaithful wife in the same house together. I have forgiven them before. Now my courage was ended. Soon after we came back from vacation, I decided to divorce my wife and I left her. My attitude changed with my dad because of my anger. I stopped talking to him. It seemed to me that I have lost faith in love. Sometimes I think I hold most of the blame. If I hadn't been in the army, I could have worked a regular job that would have allowed me to see her every day. If I had been there, she wouldn't have cheated on me. My commitment to serving my nation as an army officer soon started to fade. The idea of preserving my nation prevented me from changing jobs, although my wish was to do so. But as soon as I became aware of the problem, I almost made up my mind to be happier. I began to express appreciation for the little things in my life. In my life, I felt more blessed. I guess my view of other people changed and I made a lot of new friends. Day by day, my life started to get better. The only factor in my life is satisfaction. It is nothing more than a relationship with things. I never worried about the negative aspects when I first started to have faith in everything and let go because I believed in positive outcome by letting it go. Where your idea travels, energy flows. So, my dear friend, try not to become emotionally involved in anything. When you learn to let go, faith comes naturally.